Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and this is The Business of Content. It's the show about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. In today's episode, we're talking to a guy named Louie Woodall. Louie's been a longtime journalist. He's been writing for various publications since graduating college, and he focuses on a specific niche around financial risk. He specializes in reading financial disclosures, reporting on the risk of various calamities, things like that around various financial institutions, companies, stuff like that. And in 2020, he decided to launch a side project called Climate Risk Review. It basically took his expertise in reading financial disclosures and combined it with his interest in climate change. And what he did for that newsletter is he would actually go through what are called, or I don't know if this is what they're officially called, but they're basically climate risk disclosures that a lot of financial institutions and companies put out. These are like official documents that they put out for public consumption. And because he has so much experience going through these kinds of disclosures, he would basically dissect them in his newsletter and compare and contrast them to other disclosures of their kind. And he was just running it as a side hustle. And over time, he started building this really influential readership, people who work at banks and other financial institutions, people who worked in like climate related fields and technology. And he launched like a paid subscription version of it. And lots and lots of these readers started converting into paid subscribers. And he would sell sometimes, multiple subscriptions to a single institution. And he kept on doing this for like a year or two. And he reached this point where he's like, well, I'm making a decent amount of money from this. It's not a full time living, but it's a decent amount. I need to make a decision whether I want to keep on doing this as a side hustle or whether I want to make this my full time job. And so he eventually decides on the latter option. And in order to make this a reality, he goes to one of his subscribers, that one of his institutional subscribers. It's this tech company called Manifest Climate, and they start negotiating basically an acquisition of his newsletter. And how it ends up working out is Manifest Climate acquires the newsletter and then hires Louie as kind of the full time editor of the newsletter to do it under the umbrella of the company. And so in our interview, we talked about, the origin story of the newsletter, how he began to monetize it, and also talk about like the synergy between what he's doing with this newsletter and now this much larger tech company that owns it, and what he's doing now to basically bring those synergies together. It was just a really interesting conversation, and we dive into that entire story. But before we jump into the interview, I want to talk about this week's sponsor. That sponsor is Who Sponsors Stuff. If you own a newsletter that you monetize or want to monetize through ads, Who Sponsors Stuff is the solution you need. Founded by a team that has sold millions of dollars in newsletter ads, it's a tool that identifies potential sponsoring companies who are buying advertising in the newsletter space. Who Sponsor Stuff tracks more than 250 newsletters, records who's buying ads on them, and brings that data straight to you. They have more than 4,000 sponsors in their database who are buying ads on email newsletters. For each sponsor, they've identified the two best contacts at the company to reach out to, giving you and your sales team the tools you need to succeed. Sales Pro is used by major newsletter publisher sales teams like Flipboard, 6am City, The Daily Upside, Elevator, and Android Intelligence. Sales Pro clients get full access to the Who Sponsors Stuff database, including the ability to download data for use in automated outreach. You can plug it straight into your CRM. You also get daily alerts as new sponsors are added to the database. On average, 50 new sponsors are added every week. Reach out to learn more today. Click on the link in the episode description below to be connected with the Who Sponsors Stuff representative. Okay, now on to my interview with Louie. Hey Louie, thanks for joining me.
Hi, Simon. Pleasure to be here.
So you come from a career in traditional journalism. You specialize in a very niche topic relating to financial risk. Can you talk about that?
Certainly. So, I worked for a magazine called Risk.net straight out of university, first in London, and then I moved over to New York, where I still live. And that's a very well established business to business media company writing for banks, for asset managers, for insurance companies, and really focus on their risk management units. And so a lot of my writing was on technical banking regulation, on disruptions in financial markets, issues banks have been having with their operations, so like cyber attacks, for example, and fraud. So that was my background, writing about those sort of risks that banks face and other financial institutions face.
And so you picked up some skill sets in reporting on this niche topic. Like what are some of those? Like you seem to be really adept at reading things like financial disclosures. You probably understand complex financial products way better than the average person. Like that's the kind of things that you had to learn to do, and we'll get into why that ended up being helpful in a little bit.
Yes, I can say I definitely have read through more than my fair share of financial disclosures. Whether I understand them or not really depends on the content. But yeah, part of my role at Risk.net towards the end of my time there was heading up their data journalism unit called Risk Quantum. And the idea behind that was kind of pouring through company 10Ks and banks' risk disclosures, which are called Pillar 3 disclosures, and just going through tables of data and looking for strange movements between quarters, uh, just kind of see patterns where, for example, maybe a bank's market risk indicators went up quickly, or where they suddenly saw a big decrease in creditworthiness for some loans. Because we found that those are some stories that our readers really like to get into. The really kind of nerdy, granular stories based on data that was out in the public domain, but because this data was contained in PDFs that run for the dozens or hundreds of pages, other people weren't really looking into them. So Risk Quantum was the product that kind of got me into data journalism and kind of getting into the nitty gritty of disclosures to find interesting stories. And yes, that has definitely helped me with my career going forward.
And a lot of these documents are like compulsory, right? Like the regulators force these public companies to release a lot of this stuff. So like you said, it's in the public domain, but not a lot of people know how to actually dive into those and understand what it is they're actually saying. But there's a lot of value for the people who make investments and other kinds of large financial decisions to like really understand what these companies are disclosing.
Precisely. Yes, I think there's a lot of journalists who do cover, for example, in the US, the SEC 10K forms, which are the annual reports, or the 10Qs, which are the quarterly reports. But for banks, there's a separate kind of level of disclosure that was brought in place after the global financial crisis, and those reports are even more dense than traditional financial reports. And although I imagine bank analysts and other investor analysts go through these reports, the wider media don't. And it's interesting what sort of little interesting stories you can pick out from those reports. I remember writing a piece about Wells Fargo, which had misidentified the amount of operational risk it had between quarters, and they kind of like amended a footnote between one quarter and the second quarter, and that was just a footnote in the document. And I managed to pick that out, talk to a few people, and write a story based on that, and nobody else had picked that up. So it kind of proved to me the value of going through these kind of nerdy disclosures that no one else was really paying attention to.
And you eventually launched a Substack relating to climate, and we'll talk about that. But what was your interest in climate and environmental issues? Was this something that, like, you as like kind of a side passion that you were really interested in?
I mean, I've always been aware of climate change and climate risks, and as we all have been through the consumption of traditional media. I suppose, yes, I became more engaged in 2018, 2019, and not to sound corny, but I think Greta Thunberg, the young climate activist from Europe, was a big part of that. She actually sailed into New York a few years ago, and I remember thinking, wow, if this young girl is mobilizing so much energy to fight climate change, then how can I use my skills in the service of that cause as well? And that sort of got me into thinking, okay, well, climate change poses a risk to financial institutions. There are a few publications that are writing about this, about how climate change will affect the financial system. Maybe I can kind of see how I can get involved in that too.
Yeah. So going back to these compulsory documents that these companies and banks and stuff release, they release something relating to climate risk. Correct? There's some kind of like official report that they release around that.
Well, it's not compulsory yet in lots of jurisdictions. So climate risk is now being recognized as a real risk to investments, to financial institutions around the world. But in different regions, there are different kind of levels of required disclosures. So the UK, for example, has just introduced mandatory disclosure of climate risks and opportunities, um, that has to be those rules have to be obeyed by thousands of the largest companies in the UK now. The European Union is working on its own set of rules, and in the US, the Securities and Exchange Commission is working on climate-related disclosure rules, which would force all publicly traded companies, so all companies who you can buy shares of from the S&P 500, they would all have to include in their 10K annual reports detailed information on how climate change could affect them. And this is how
Yeah, so give me an example of that.
Absolutely. So it can climate risks are generally categorized into two silos. You've got physical risks and you've got transition risks. Physical risks are the things like floods, storm surges, extreme weather events, but also sort of longer running threats like rising sea level and droughts. And so these sorts of instances, these sort of events are eroding companies' bottom lines. And you can see some examples of that with like the wildfire seasons in the US are getting worse and worse and longer, and wildfires are exacerbated by exceedingly dry conditions, and those dry conditions are coming about more frequently because of climate change. So that's one category of risks. The other category of climate risks is known as transition risks, and these are the risks that companies face from the transition to a low carbon future. So transition risks most obviously affect oil and gas companies, coal mining companies, who are producing commodities that are going to be used less and less as we go forward, as we electrify our economy, as people embrace electric vehicles, etc. So transition risks means businesses which make sense in the kind of fossil fuel age, but may make less sense in the low carbon future. And because we're never sure exactly how fast this low carbon transition is going to take place or is taking place, that's a very difficult risk to forecast. And I give the example of what's going on in the US with the Senate's negotiations over climate spending. 1 minute it looks like there's going to be climate spending, another minute there's not. Just the other day, we saw that there is going to be a bill that includes climate spending, and that spending might accelerate the low carbon transition and leave a number of companies who weren't prepared for that, losing revenues, getting into trouble with their creditors, and eventually, maybe even defaulting. So those are the two categories of risks that face companies.
So a specific example then would be like an insurance company in their climate risk document would say 30% of the homes that we insure are near the coast, and because of the chance of sea level rise or increased hurricane, that we could see higher than expected claims on damaged homes or something like that.
Exactly. And if the insurance company isn't pricing their policies appropriately, they may be swamped by that sudden deluge of claims and be unable to pay them out or go into financial difficulty trying to bail them out. The same is true of wildfires as well. In the West, you have a number of insurers who are already cutting back the policies that they sell to cover certain regions of California, etc., because they are so susceptible to wildfire risk.
So now let's talk about how you took this interest in climate and your ability to read these kind of documents and this thickly jargoned kind of these risk reports. How you married those two together to create your own publication. You launched on Substack something called Climate Risk Review. When did you start coming up with the idea for launching this?
Yeah, I kind of took a meandering road to becoming a Substacker. I started writing short news roundups about how climate risk was getting more and more the attention of financial institutions and financial regulators back in 2019. And I basically published on LinkedIn like the top 5 stories in my mind related to climate related financial risk and regulation. That evolved into the Substack at the beginning of 2020. And I didn't really have a clear plan in mind. I just wanted to, be writing about these topics because I wasn't doing that in my day job. It wasn't of interest to my day job at that time, it was a way for me to kind of like scratch that itch of wanting to do something climate related that I mentioned earlier. So initially, the Substack was yes a weekly roundup of news, and then I do a weekly sort of opinion thought analysis piece, and then I started doing what I called the Inside Climate Disclosures series. And each week I would go into a specific financial institution's climate disclosure and kind of just pick out what I thought was interesting in there, where I thought they kind of excelled in explaining their risks and climate opportunities as well, and where I thought they kind of fell down. And I used as a benchmark the recommendations of what is known as the Task Force for Climate Related Financial Disclosures, the TCFD, This was a body set up by the Financial Stability Board, which is a body of global regulators, and it was also backed by Michael Bloomberg. And this TCFD group came up with a list of recommendations for how companies should report their climate risks and opportunities. And so I kind of use that as the rubric to kind of assess these individual financial institutions' climate disclosures. And it was all very subjective because it's a kind of an emerging field, climate disclosure. And I thought, well, if I go through these in detail, I understand the TCFD recommendations. I understand what a good report's supposed to look like. I think, I might as well give my informed opinion of how certain companies are doing. And that proved to be very popular. People seem to really enjoy that series. I got a number of subscribers through that series, and a few people wanted me to even reached out and asked me if I would review their disclosures. So obviously, kind of like touch a nerve. But that was a very technical type of writing. It was also
Well,
very exhaustive.
how did you start finding that audience?
Well,
How
partly
did you start finding that audience?
Well, partly from LinkedIn. So I'd say yes, the bulk of my audience generation was through LinkedIn. And yes, network effects were people spreading the news about this publication through word of mouth. I get people email me saying, "Oh, so and so told me about this publication. It's great. I want to learn more." So I think it was very organic. I didn't do any paid spend or anything. But the climate risk world in the financial sector, at least, was pretty small knit, close knit back in 2019, and probably still is pretty small. So word got around pretty quickly.
So, with my media industry newsletter, the things that always, blows me away is I'll get these notifications that people are signing up, and I'll see, their work email addresses. And I see someone from like a high up executive from like Disney or Netflix or the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal will sign up for my newsletter. I'm like, holy crap, that means, I'm reaching that core demographic that I'm trying to reach. What were you noticing as you're growing this newsletter? Like, who are these people who are that interested in this super niche topic that were like signing up for your newsletter? You don't have to tell me exactly who, but like what kind of institutions and stuff like that.
I love an opportunity to boast. I noticed definitely that I was being taken seriously when I started getting signups with people who had email addresses from like the Bank of England, the Federal Reserve, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, which is a US financial regulator. So those are kind of the aha moments. Like, I'm obviously doing something right here. And also then getting like bulk subscriptions from specific banks. So like large banks in the US, I noticed more and more people signing up from the same bank. And I imagine what happened then, actually, I know this happened for one of my contacts that, oh yeah, one person at one bank found out about me and then told everybody in their department, you should sign up to this newsletter. So I saw these batches of signups
Yeah.
from the same bank. And that was encouraging. That made me feel that I was, gaining momentum.
Yeah, and I experience that too, where I'll get like 5 signups from the exact same domain, and so it's an indication that someone in the office forwarded it around one of my articles. And so you launched the free version in like 2020,
That's right.
right?
Yeah.
And then when did you launch the paid subscription, and what did you charge?
Yes. So I started the free version in February 2020, and I launched the paywall in end of September 2020. So I gave it, a good 6, 7 months. And I trialed the subscription period as well. I let people know, like, this is what's going to be behind the paywall, the Thursday opinion pieces I was writing, and the Inside Climate Disclosure series was going to go behind the paywall. So I gave people a few weeks to kind of get a taste for the content and then put the wall in place. And I priced it, I suppose, pretty high for Substack at that time. I was doing $15 a month and $135 for the year. And yeah, I got a bunch of signups straight away. And what was interesting, I started getting enterprise subscriptions pretty early on as well. Like a few of my oldest readers who work at like large consultancies or large banks were like, Louis, we'd like to get subscription, but we'd like it for 20 people. Can you do us a deal? And I started doing those enterprise subscription deals on a kind of bespoke basis, ad hoc basis, and that drove a lot of my early revenue.
Yeah, a lot of Substackers, especially in the B2B space, they've been taking advantage of the group subscriptions where you can offer a discount if they sign up for a minimum of like 5 subscriptions or more at a time. So that sounds like what you were offering to these enterprise clients.
Absolutely, yes. I had about 5 or 6 initially, and no, that was really heartening because I suppose if you're being cheeky, one person could have subscribed and just forwarded the email, right? I don't think Substack has a brilliant way to ensure that paywalls are being respected. So I thought it was a sign of confidence in me that people were willing to shell out, $1,000, $2,000 for an enterprise subscription to a little one man shop like me.
Yeah. So that was September 2020, and then moving forward, you still had a full time day job, so you were assessing risk and all that kind of stuff for your publisher. Still, how did they feel about you kind of branching off? You weren't a direct competitor, but you were in the same kind of niche as them somewhat.
Yeah, I kept everything above board. I told my boss that I was doing this newsletter when I first started in February. And at that time, as I said, my company wasn't really looking at climate risk because it was a new topic in the context of financial institutions, at least for the mainstream. And then as I kind of got more and more popular and as more and more things started happening in the climate risk space, um, it became clear that my company was looking to kind of engage in that. So it got to the point where I wasn't told to stop it. I was told like you kind of have to make a choice about whether you're going to do this or whether you're going to stay with us and integrate some of your work with us. And that's when I kind of started to think, okay, I do love writing about financial risk management generally, but I was getting really interested in this climate risk niche. And I thought, all right, I want to be able to do this full time. How can I do this full time? And that sort of set up my next step.
Yeah, so you eventually the newsletter gets acquired by this company called I think Manifest Climate. When did you first become aware of them? When did the conversation start about between you and this company? Did they reach out to you?
Yes, Manifest Climate and I go back a long way. They were one of my first enterprise subscriptions I mentioned earlier. So they back then they were a company of I think only 30 people, 20 people maybe, and they called up and said we'd love to get an enterprise subscription, and gave them a deal. And even then, at that first conversation, I think back in September 2020, they were like, interested to know about what your next steps are going to be, Louis. How do you want to evolve this newsletter? How can you Are you interested in creating content for other companies? So I could tell there was some interest there initially. Um, and so we kept in touch, and I noticed that they were some of my biggest readers. Like you can see like the open rates and who's been engaging with your content on Substack. And I could see that the Manifest Climate folks are the ones consistently opening my email. So I thought, okay, they're definitely very interested. And I suppose I knew that if I asked the question, they might have a place for me in their company. But I'll admit, before the beginning of 2021, I was a little bit nervous because they were a startup. They were 30 people. They were based in Toronto. I was based in New York. And having worked for an established company all my life, I wasn't in. I wasn't, fully prepared. I think to make the leap. But we kept in touch, and I actually even had some conversations with some of their staff about how I went about going through companies' climate disclosures, because that's also what Manifest Climate does. So we had a little interactions here and there, but then at the beginning of 2021, when I realized, right, I really can't. It's not really tenable for me to do my full time day job and do the newsletter. It is becoming a conflict, and also, if I want to do this full time, I have to move somewhere else. So that's when I was thinking seriously about moving, and it coincided with the time that Manifest Climate closed its seed round. So they had money in the bank, and I suddenly felt, okay, this is the real deal. And I thought, okay, it's a good time to make a move. So I got in touch with the co-CEOs of the company again, said, look, I'd be interested in finding out how I could fit into your organization. And we took the conversation from there.
There's a huge burgeoning market of these consultancies like Manifest Client and other products and services because every company is thinking about this kind of transition that's happening, in terms of energy savings, different stuff like that. It strikes me that like you could have charged like really high rates for advertising to reach this like very influential audience that you had. It was just because you had a full time day job and you were probably spending every available free moment on content creation that you just didn't really have time to think about building that out as like part of your business?
That's true. Yes, as I said, I kind of took a meandering path to Substack. I didn't have a business plan in place. It was just something I
Mm-hmm.
did on the side. And I think partly because, 2020, this is the height of the pandemic, there was a lot of free time I had. So I found it easier to kind of spend time on the newsletter back then. And as it got into 2021, I found like trying to juggle the newsletter and juggle other things was becoming increasingly difficult. But yeah, advertising, that was some route I hadn't explored, but it might have been something I could build out. But I realized I knew I wouldn't be able to devote the resources or the time to kind of build that out while doing a full time job as well.
Yeah, I don't know. You'd be surprised because, what I found with advertising on mine, I've never done any kind of cold outreach or anything like that. Like the people who advertise on my newsletter are people who read my newsletter. That's the advantage of a B2B audience is like, the people who work in your space are also the ones who are, looking to market themselves to your readership and stuff like that. So you maybe could have just recruited advertisers from your own readership. But you get approached by Manifest Climate. It's like a consultancy with like a little bit of a tech spin, right? Like it has a platform it's enterprise clients that pay a lot of money and they can log into a dashboard and monitor different things and stuff like that.
Manifest Climate is what is called a climate risk planning software platform. So it did start Manifest Climate as
Yeah.
a consultancy, and then it kind of has evolved into this really exciting tech company. So it's the software as a service model, and the idea about this climate risk planning software is that it can help companies of all shapes and sizes, assess their climate risks and opportunities, put together disclosures that really very well communicate their risks and opportunities, and also provide companies with market intelligence, information on their peers in terms of how they're doing climate wise, and also like education, so like training videos, etc. So it's kind of all in one, platform for mastering climate risk at your company. And yes, there are some consulting projects that happen alongside that, but the real, premier piece of the company is this platform.
And what's the synergy between what you're doing with Climate Risk Review and what they're doing? Because they weren't buying you because they wanted to grow your subscription business, right? It was, in fact, after you got acquired, you shut down the paid subscription. So what was the synergy there?
Well, part of the platform is this market intelligence module, and that is essentially news aggregation and analysis at the intersection of climate change and business. So they wanted to build out essentially an editorial product within this platform, and I'd already proven myself to be an accomplished editor, writer, aggregator through Climate Risk Review. So they saw me as a natural fit to help build out that part of the product. Of course, the newsletter also helped with kind of marketing and kind of establishing climate manifest climate as a thought leader in climate risk, because this is a new space, and even though I was a one-man shop, my name was kind of out there. I'd hosted a number of webinars on climate risk or moderated panels on climate risk. And that's interesting. Actually, going back to what you said about advertising, I wouldn't get people reaching out for me to ask if they could advertise on my newsletter. They'd reach out to me and say, "Oh, Louis, can you do a presentation for us? Can you moderate a panel for us?" So I was very much kind of visible because individuals at companies realized that I would be a good kind of neutral party to host these sort of virtual events. So coming onto Manifest Climate, yes, part of it was also providing more visibility for the brand and kind of establishing its brand as kind of real thought leaders in the climate risk space. So there was the editorial part of it, which is me working for the Manifest Climate platform, building out this market intelligence part of the platform, and then there's kind of the marketing part of it, building brand, building awareness of our company through the newsletter.
Yeah, and it's just this like really interesting way that media is going where, more and more companies are hiring journalists to do what, the dirty word is content marketing, which is sort of what it is, but you're just acting like a journalist. Like I'm guessing they're not really censoring anything you're doing. You're able to continue on and do your journalism. It's monetized in a different way than a traditional journalism outlet. Like it's not subscriptions or advertising, or at least on the low end you could argue maybe it's enterprise subscriptions, but it's just not the same thing. It's like the journalism is like a loss leader for whatever the main product it sells.
I think what's interesting is that I am part of sort of like that top end of the sales funnel in some degree. Like those who subscribe
Yeah.
to my newsletter, once they found out that I'd been bought by Manifest Climate, some of my readers were like, "Oh, well, if Louis joined this company, let's find out what it's all about." And I think we've only had like one or two subscribers who have actually bought onto the platform directly through my newsletter. But it has been great to kind of like generate leads to help the sales folks kind of refine their message. So I feel like that's part of the benefit that journalists can bring, because I'm actually not doing, I suppose, content through the newsletter at least. I'm not doing content marketing. I'm not writing like why our product is so great and why you must have it. I'm writing about
Yeah.
issues and topics that relate that the clients or our would-be clients are interested in. So like how regulations are going to affect climate disclosure, how banks are changing the way that they assess potential borrowers based on their climate risks. So this is all interesting. We're kind of giving out free information, free analysis, and kind of hoping that builds some goodwill and interest, and also, as I said, establishes our credentials as really thoughtful leaders in this space instead of just a company who's just plugging away about how great they are and actually not producing much to show for it.
And when did the acquisition close?
The acquisition closed in November 2021. So that's when I became officially part of the Manifest Climate team.
Yeah, so we're creeping up. By the time this podcast comes out, we'll be somewhat close to your 1 year anniversary. So you went from maybe working on this 10 to 20 hours a week to now it's your full time gig. How has your role changed? How has that increased amount of time? Has it sped up your audience growth? Like how are things different now that you're working on this full time?
Yes, so I still have full editorial control of Climate Risk Review, the newsletter, but over time, we've been integrating it more and more with Manifest Climate as a whole. And actually, by the time this podcast comes out, it's very likely that I'll have actually migrated from Substack, and Climate Risk Review will be part of Manifest Climate's existing infrastructure for email newsletters. And that's important because, of course, Substack's great, but there's not much in the way of tracking, ability to kind of follow on individual subscribers and kind of segment the audience in a specific way. So I think the migration makes sense. The migration makes sense in the terms that Climate Risk Review is supposed to be helping drive potential clients towards Manifest Climate.
Yeah.
So by the time this comes out, then there might have been a transition. But in terms of the content, the editorial, that is still under my control, and I will be continuing to kind of lead that going forward. But the other part of my job is producing editorial for this market intelligence module of the climate risk planning software that we run, and that is kind of similar to what I do for Climate Risk Review. It's kind of news aggregation, as I said. So kind of going through a bunch of stories, picking out the interesting bits, packaging together in these useful articles that can only be read on our platform by our clients. So that is kind of the behind the paywall side of it now. So Climate Risk Review is fully in front of the paywall, and I'm still writing behind a paywall, but it's now on this platform rather than on an email newsletter. So I do feel I have more time to work on Climate Risk Review, but I'm also got my other duties, which are building out this other kind of content product on the Manifest Climate platform. So I've still kind of got a dual focus, but everything I write is climate related, which is exactly what I wanted.
Has your audience growth accelerated?
Oh yes, I had a big jump when the announcement was made that I was acquired, and I do feel like there has been a bit of kind of cross pollination in terms of subscribers who are part of Climate Risk Review sign on to Manifest Climate's marketing newsletters and vice versa. And I feel like, yes, my rate has increased. I feel like I was getting about 100, 150 a month before Manifest Climate, and now I'm like 200, 250 a month. I seem to be getting in terms of my rate of new subscribers. So it has ticked up, but I do wonder, and I'm interested in your thoughts on this, Simon, whether Substack's new features, especially the recommendation feature, is driving some of that, because I've had my newsletter recommended by a number of publications. And I think I can see that it has driven a number of subscriptions. So I do think Manifest Climate has something to do with that, but I think also how Substack's evolved may have helped as well.
Yeah, the recommendations feature it rolled out where it allows each individual writer on Substack to pick other Substack newsletters it likes, almost kind of like a blog roll, so that when people subscribe to their newsletter, it then automatically recommends all these other newsletters they've read, and it has introduced network effects to Substack, which has been a game changer because the Substack's weakness was always that it was very easy to export your email list and simply move on to another platform. And so this has created some network effects that actually make it more beneficial to be on Substack's platform, but without it being like a Facebook algorithm or YouTube algorithm. So keeping its kind of more decentralized, ethos. So yeah, it's been huge for me. It's more than doubled my growth rate. Wow. on a week to week basis. So that's been really huge for me. I think it helps that I write about newsletters and stuff like that. So a lot of newsletter writers read me regularly, so they're more likely to recommend me. But yeah, that's been a big thing for Substack since they did it. So you talked about the synergies. You said two of your subscribers became enterprise clients, and like to be clear, this is a lot different than converting someone into a paid subscriber where they're just paying like $100 a year. Like the sales cycle for an enterprise client can be weeks, months, sometimes even years, and they're paying, obviously each client is worth a lot more than an individual subscriber to a newsletter. How are you thinking about that, or how are your new bosses thinking about that in terms of trying to track the ROI of your writing in terms of bringing in lead generation and stuff like that? Have there been any talks about that? Like, there's obviously within Google Analytics, within things like HubSpot, you can try to track the user journey and how they end up into your CRM and everything like that. Have there been any moves on that front?
Well, that's part of this transfer from Substack. So the email marketing system that's used internally in Manifest Climate is Pardo. And I'm not familiar with it myself, but the functionality it has, according to our marketing team, is epic. So that's going to allow, yes, a much more granular understanding of how people who subscribe to Climate Risk Review, what they click through to read on our website, what sort of interest they have in relation to our software and our consulting services. So I think that's a big part of why they want to integrate Climate Risk Review with Pardo, with Manifest Climate's actual own platform. Because at the moment we don't have much of that, I suppose, in terms of the ROI per subscriber. As I said, we've had a few subscribers who have emailed in, said, "Oh, I subscribe to Climate Risk Review. I'd be interested to learn more about the company." So there's been a number of like exploratory calls, some demo calls, because of people know about Manifest Climate through me. But yeah, I don't have hard figures on the conversion rate there, and it is, I suppose, a bit woolly anyway, isn't it? Like, people may have come to Manifest Climate because they heard about it through my newsletter, but they got convinced by the sales team, but they got convinced by other facets of the enterprise software that we have. So it's kind of hard to quantify, but I am interested to see, once I'm integrated with Pardo, like how many of my subscribers are actually really engaged in building out their own climate risk expertise by engaging with our platform, with becoming enterprise clients, and how many are actually just want that kind of weekly news roundup, just want to be able to keep their feet in the water and learn more about climate risk and regulation. I don't know about you, but I feel like only about probably 10% of my readers are actually like the hardcore, um, who are really interested in the sort of products that Manifest Climate has available. And I think I'll get a better sense of that once we're probably integrated with this more granular, tracing software that we have with Pardo.
So what do you want to accomplish next? Do you want to build an editorial team? Do you want to move into other mediums like podcasts and video? What's kind of like your next 2 year horizon in terms of, how you can take your journalism and your content to the next level?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so with the market intelligence module of the Manifest Climate platform, we did hire a deputy editor. So I'm the editorial lead. I have a wonderful deputy editor called Dana Goldfinger, who has really, taken so much off my plate, and is a fantastic writer as well to boot. So between us, we edit and write articles on a daily basis, on the intersection of climate change and business. There are a number of climate strategists who are part of Manifest Climate, who do multiple roles. They do presentations to clients. They take part in product ideation and product development, but they also help to write these articles as well. So there's kind of like a band of semi-writers, semi-consultants who contribute content, but Dana and myself are the ones who kind of polish it all up, put it all together, and publish it on our platform. So that's how we're producing content right now. It's text-based content, one article a day behind the paywall. We also produced white papers in front of the paywall to kind of drive marketing leads, to drive interest in the company as well. So that's another type of content. What I'm really interested in is building out data journalism. Like I did at risk.net, I like to build out more data-based journalism. And we have great potential here because Manifest Climate, as well as having this market intelligence and this training aspect, has this climate journey component, which allows companies to understand where their risks and opportunities are and to disclose those risks and opportunities in a very clear manner. We also ourselves analyze hundreds of climate disclosures that are out there in the world. So what I was doing as a one-man band going through manually, we now have AI assisted software to help us go through dozens and dozens of climate disclosures and pick out really interesting details. So what I want to do is leverage that database to write some really cool content, produce really cool infographics, and kind of show to the world, look, companies are writing more and more about how climate change is affecting them, but you only get real insights when you kind of aggregate that data and slice it and dice it in certain ways. And I'm really looking forward to being able to write some interesting, long form pieces and database pieces, looking at, for example, what climate scenarios are banks using the most? How do banks interpret the emissions produced by their portfolios? Um, what physical risk, wildfire, drought, flood, is the biggest threat to companies in the United States? That sort of information, those sort of stories we'll be able to write with this database we have. We just need to get to a point where we can kind of connect that database with the editorial side, and so that's what I'm going to be working on most of the next year.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. Yeah, there's a lot of companies that are kind of at this kind of intersection of data and journalism. You think of like CB Insights for like healthcare. You think of Freightways for logistics. You
Oh
think
yeah.
of Bloomberg, obviously, is kind of the at Bloomberg, its terminals. How it relates to Bloomberg Media. I think there's just like a lot of interesting synergies that are possible there across a lot of different energy industries.
Absolutely. And I think some people might think that, oh, well, Bloomberg will just do it all, right? It's a massive company. It's got the firepower. It's got the expertise. But actually, there's these little niches, and climate risk is still one, I think, where if you've built a reputation for being a good journalist or a good analyst in this area, I think that counts for a lot. And so I'm hoping we can, build on that reputation and create a really cool product, multiple products that our clients will enjoy.
Well, Louis, those were all the questions I had for you. Where can people find you online?
You can find me at Twitter at Louie Woodall. I'm on LinkedIn. Actually, I'm most active on LinkedIn at Louie Woodall. And you can visit Manifest Climate at manifestclimate.com. Climate Risk Review, the Substack, is at climateriskreview, all one word, .com.
Awesome. Well, this is a lot of fun. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Simon. Really appreciate being on.